welcome. You guys have been patient, and thank you for coming to chat with us. Let me introduce the folks who are on the panel, and then we'll talk a little bit about the old times and try and give you some historical perspective, and we'll take questions and answers, because your reward for showing up is you get to grill us. So immediately to my left, Cheryl Rubin, who was with DC probably a total of 25 years?
Almost 25 years, until the end of 2010.
Most of it responsible for DC's licensing and what was known as the DC Direct line of figures and statues and weird shit that we made ourselves that were not comic books. To her left, we have Barbara Slate, wonderful graphic novelist and cartoonist whose connection to DC was primarily a series called Angel Love that she did in the 1980s, but she went on from that to do work for the competitor who we do not name, and to do independent...
Marvel.
We do not name it. Lesser people might. But also went on to do some wonderful independent graphic novel projects on political subjects like the January 6th Commission report, and we'll let her tell you a little bit more about some of those activities. And holding up...
It was the Mueller report.
The Mueller report, sorry. Sorry. Your memory goes at my age. I will get many corrections through the course of the panel, or possibly from some of you. And holding up the far left, though with this panel we're all somewhat to the left of Big Bird, is Big Bird's former attorney and the general counsel of DC Comics for 20 years of her career, Lillian Lasserson. And she is still active in the field representing creators to this day, wrestling DC Comics, Marvel Comics, and other nameless idiots to the ground for the sake of treating creative people decently. Yeah. And I'm Paul Levitz, and I spent my life, it feels like, at DC Comics, about 50 years all told between my first freelance assignment and my last freelance assignment, in between writing a bunch of comics, running the business on one level or another for several decades, and finishing up as the president and publisher, and then doing a little consulting. Still occasionally write a comic book, mostly doing teaching these days. That's us. So why the hell are we talking about DC Comics in the 1980s? Let me set the stage by making the argument that I believe, as a historian of comics, I was a comic fan before I came to DC. I've written about both the history of DC and the field of comics in general, that there are only 3 times in the now almost 90-year history of the American comic book that there was a large-scale line of comics that was breaking ground and really changing the whole industry around it. There's a, how do I put this? There's a reverse of critical mass, that it gets harder and harder to have important and interesting creativity done the larger line of comics or books, movies, or anything that you're making. It's kind of the reverse of the auteur theory. If you're doing one movie at a time, and you're a brilliant director, a Spielberg, a Chris Nolan, different guys and gals in different generations, you occasionally are able to rise to a level that nobody's ever seen before and do something unique and wonderful. When you're trying to do that across 10 or 20 or 30 different projects simultaneously, it means you've got a large troop of people working and keeping them all not just synchronized, not just working together, but aspiring together in that fashion to change a field and break the limits is a very, very rare thing. EC Comics accomplished that in the 1950s. Bill Gaines as publisher, Al Feldstein and Harvey Kurtzman as the two editors working there, in many ways did better comics than had ever been done in America before on a consistent basis for several years. Mad magazine emerges from that and has a profound effect on the American culture. And even though lesser, things like Tales from the Crypt that we're still seeing the resonance of today carries weight and measure from that. Marvel Comics in the 1960s with Stan Lee as the editor, very small group of people working with him, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko as the primary resident geniuses along with him. Changes the game again in a different fashion. Again, it's a small line, but it's groundbreaking in many, many different ways. And then in the 1980s, from the early 80s to, I'd argue, the early 90s, you have DC Comics doing that. Not everything we did was groundbreaking, not everything we did was good, but it was a large line. In those years, we were probably producing an average of 700 or 800 different individual issues a year. And that included things that really changed how the comic book industry worked, how the comic book art form worked in America, and what life was like for creative people. I'm extraordinarily proud to have been a part of that, along with these people. Jeanette Kahn, who would have been here with us today and sends her regards to all of you, but is dealing with some personal issues. Karen Berger, who was the editor who really spearheaded Vertigo, which changed an awful lot of the field in those years, who also would have loved to be with us. It would have been much more fun than dealing with her broken feet, which are healing. Many other people who made important contributions. So let's time travel. The American comic book was born as a cheap, badly produced impulse buy, available ubiquitously everywhere. Newsstands would have been on every corner. When I was going to high school, about 4 or 5 blocks from here, I would walk back from school and I'd be able to pick up my comic books at the newsstand on Lexington and 14th Street before getting on the train.
What year was that, Paul?
71 to 73, 70 to 73. Full selection there. And then when I got off the subway in Brooklyn going home, there was a mom and pop candy store right there by the subway stop with another full selection. And they wouldn't have the same things. And you'd have to look around and be surprised because it was a very random system. That form of comics was dying by the early 1980s. The newsstands of America were changing dramatically. You don't see a real newsstand almost anywhere anymore. Magazines are now demonstrably of a disappearing form. Newspapers are a disappeared form, by and large. But we were already feeling the power of that. That part of the comics world was going away. And the comic shop, which then was a little over a decade old, was beginning to emerge as the new bright light that we were moving towards, which would change the dynamic of the business. We knew there was a new future. We knew it would be largely older consumers because you had to travel to get to a comic shop. They weren't conveniently located. We knew you would want comics that you had specifically chosen rather than buying this month's issue because it had a gorilla on the cover, which was the conventional wisdom back in the 1950s. But we didn't know how to build that. We didn't know what it was going to be. So we began experimenting. And representing one of the earliest experiments we have in that is Barbara Slate. Barbara, I'd love you to tell the story of how Angel Love comes to be, because I think it's a perfect story about Jeanette Kahn and her eclectic view of the possibilities of comics and her view of art in the world. And Jeanette was the creative leader of DC from 1976 to 2001. And in the 1981, she became the president of the company. and had more, even more authority to follow her passions. And she finds Barbara how?
On the street.
Well, tell us what street it was.
Um,
What were you doing there that she could pick you up?
So it really wasn't on the street. I was doing a greeting card line called Ms. Liz, and it was in the 70s. Was it in the 70s? It must have been this. I get my decades mixed up. But it was a greeting card line for the woman who speaks her mind, and the name Ms., MS, was what women were starting to call themselves, because with women's liberation, there were two things that were really important to me. One was equal pay, and the other one was men are called Mr., and we are like Ms., Mrs., and why did we have to be the single gal or the married one when men don't say anything? So it's always Mr. So I started this greeting card line, and it became very successful because there was nothing like it. It was very not like Hallmark at all. And my sayings were something like, if my place is in the home, then get out. And I know I'm not easy to live with, but you're no bargain either. Thank you. I'd love you if you were unfaithful. I'd miss you too. Things like that. And what I discovered as I was watching these, I'd go to stationery stores and watch women look at my cards and laugh, 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 and put them back and buy Hallmark. Like, I love you, sweetheart. And so that was a big lesson, and I softened Ms. Liz. And then she became very successful. And I had a comic strip of Ms. Liz in Cosmopolitan magazine every month, and they had never done comics before. So I was the first comic in Cosmopolitan. And then I was on the Today Show with an animated cartoon of Ms. Liz. So I hated being on TV. I just hated it. And I wanted them to get experts on what Ms. Liz was saying. Like, the first panel was, it was 4 panels, and it was Ms. Liz at the movies with her boyfriend, and she's looking at him, and he's crying. And she said, oh, he's so sensitive. I love men who are free enough to cry. And then she looks at him, and the tears are coming down, and she goes, sissy. So that was the first segment. And then Jane Pauley would ask me questions about, it's really not fair that we treat men like that, and, blah, blah, blah. So that was, and so Ms. Liz, I was doing Ms. Liz for 9 years, every day, every moment. And I was in business with my husband, who is now my ex-husband. So I will warn everybody, never go into business with your husband. It's not a good idea. So it was, Ms. Liz's time was up, basically, with the divorce. And anyway, you don't want to hear all about that. And so I was lying on the couch one afternoon, not feeling, kind of depressed the way I am right now. Goddamn election. And so I was feeling very depressed about where Ms. Liz was going and the divorce, and I was turning 40 and feeling like a real failure. And the phone rang. And it was this guy, Than Quit, who was friends with my husband. And he said, he made the mistake of saying, hi, Barbara, how are you? And I just unloaded on him. He asked, so I told him, my husband's dyeing his hair green and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so he said, you should call Jeanette Kahn. She's president of DC Comics. And I said, oh, that's very sweet, and I hung up. I said, there's no way in the world I'm calling anybody. I just wasn't in the mood, and who is she anyway? And I don't know anything about comics, about I know there's superheroes, but anyway. So I was running out of cigarettes at the time, and that was the only thing that could get me off that couch. And I went to the corner store, and there, right there, in the newsstand, was a picture of Jeanette Kahn and Superman.
Savvy.
What?
Savvy.
Yes, Savvy.
Savvy magazine,
Yes. So I totally believe in signs. So that was a sign for me, and I went back and I called, and I made an appointment with Jeanette. And it was all timing, because she was president of DC Comics. I mean, it was all men, and so I was thrilled to meet her, and she kind of looked like a superhero. She had on red, and she had this red lipstick, and she was very glamorous, and her office was filled with all this pop stuff of characters, and I thought she was fabulous, and so she wanted to do she wanted to do something for girls, and it was timing. It was perfect timing, and she said, "Can you do something? Could you create something for us?" And that's how Angel Love came to be. And then she introduced me to the wonderful Karen Berger, who was my editor. This is the first editor I ever had. So that's the way it happened. Do you want me to continue? There's not a whole lot more, but
Well, give them a sentence or two of what Angel Love was, for those who missed that in the process or haven't rediscovered it.
Well, Angel Love, in this world of superheroes, was this character who came to New York on a Greyhound bus. That's what I did when I was 20. I came on a Greyhound bus, and all those emotions that I was feeling, I could get into that character. And even today, I can close my eyes and remember what it was like to be on that bus. So Angel comes off, and she comes off the bus, and immediately, this happened to me, I'm stepping off the bus, and there's this guy going, "Hey, baby, you want to be a model?" And I was thrilled. No one ever asked me to be a model before. So, and Angel was drugs, sex, and rock and roll, which was so unusual at that time. I think you can tell more about the commotion that it caused. There was a lot of people who said, "Oh, you're ruining the industry, the comic book industry, and all that." And it was, I was so naive at that time. I didn't know that when Comic Buyer's Guide ran the entire first issue, what a big deal that was. Now looking back at it, I thought, boy, that was a big deal, but it just felt like, oh, that's nice. So, we did 6 issues. And also, I didn't know that it was a limited series. I thought I was going to go on forever, and I would still be doing Angel Love today if I had the opportunity. I loved doing it, and I just loved the writing. I loved drawing it, and it was so much fun to, run into DC and open that book and see the work, and it was wonderful. So I was very disappointed when I got canned.
Well, you didn't get canned. It was a period where we experimented with a lot of different things. I think Angel Love, in many ways, was intended as an alternative to the Archie view of the world that had been all that had been presented to young girls for a generation was either Archie or the romance comics, which were,
Romance.
It was the 1950s view of I need a man.
But
Logic.
Angel Love was drugs, sex, and rock and roll. And so I talked about abortion, and I talked about, what else did I talk about?
Well, whatever was
happening.
was at the edge at that time, and there was
But what I got a lot was teachers from the inner schools who wrote me and said, "Thank you, my kids can relate to this." So it was, and I also got letters from irate mothers. How could you do this? And, they see this cute little girl and they take it, and then all of a sudden, there's drugs and there's sex and there's, Angel falls for a guy who's into coke and all that, which I was having a ball, but I didn't realize the impact it was making, so.
cool. Thank you, Barbara. So part of what made that time special in my view was the dynamic of the staff. And any company has a combination of the creative people in comics. Those are mostly freelance writers and artists, like Barbara was. She wasn't coming in the office every day. She was coming in for meetings periodically and to deliver her work, but she wasn't part of it every day. But the in-office people tend to be business people. And I think your description of Jeanette was, if anything, a tame description. You know, she was often this figure racing through the halls, shedding sequins or feathers
She
or
looked like a superhero.
a trail of something, and with almost anybody in the world next to her. You know, we lost Quincy Jones, whatever it was, a week ago, and I always remember having met him at the office, and at the other end of the spectrum, Fab Five Freddy, or one of the Knicks, or Jaron Lanier, who was one of the inventors of assisted artificial reality. You could find anyone in and out of Jeanette's office. It was a unique meeting place. And one of the things that Jeanette and I tried to do in running the company in those years was create a staff that was sensitive to the creative desires and passions. Licensing is an area that is very much a business area. It's, for a comic book company, it's probably the most profitable part of any comic book company's business, because you're not actually publishing anything or creating anything as a product and taking a risk in the marketplace. You're having other people pay you for the privilege of taking a risk in the marketplace. We had started bringing a licensing team in, and Cheryl was, I guess, really our second hire in that field. Tell the audience a little bit about what your background was coming to us in it, and why that fit with working with the creative community, and where that led you within DC over the years.
Sure. So I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Sculpture from the now defunct Philadelphia College of Art, which became University of the Arts and just closed down, unfortunately, this past year due to bankruptcy. And I went into window displays because famous artists like Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg made their living doing window displays. And that led me to Macy's, and I ended up working in Macy's special productions and annual events on the Thanksgiving Day parade. And my job there was marketing and promotions and working with all of the sponsors of the floats and the balloons. And that was a very creative role because we always had to make sure that the floats and the balloons adhered to the brand guidelines of the sponsor. So if it was a Garfield balloon, the balloon had to look like Garfield really looks like it. So there was a Superman balloon throughout the history of the Thanksgiving Day parade. And I think it was 1986 when the Superman balloon famously went down Broadway with his hand like this. Oops. Oops. The air just, all the helium went out of the balloon like that. And my job was to pitch the sponsors on the floats and balloons for the next parade. So literally, like the day after the parade, or the Monday after Thanksgiving, I would call up everybody, and that Monday I called up the woman who was running licensing at DC Comics and said, well, do you want to, sorry about that, but do you want to re-sign up for the following year? And she said, I just can't deal with this right now. I don't have enough staff. And I thought, oh, that would be a really interesting place to work. So long story short, January of 1987, I started there. And, I didn't have a business background. Forgot to tell you that when you hired me. I had an art background.
I should have checked, I know.
I should have checked. But throughout my career, I always hired people with art backgrounds when I could, because as long as they were creative and thought outside the box, I knew that I could teach them the business skills that we needed. And the role that I had was so incredible because I could use all of my art skills. a lot of my art skills were put to use in looking at, all the toys, all the Batman toys and Superman toys that you've all seen, collected, grown up with. Somebody had to look at the anatomy of those sculptures for the toys and make sure that the anatomy was okay. And so that was part of my job, along with a great team of people doing that with me. Throughout the years, we produced over 250, if not 300 brand style guides in order to keep Batman and Superman especially like very fresh and relevant to consumers of all ages, from babies all the way up to collectors. And then we would create new art programs many times a year to give to the manufacturers that we licensed the rights to use the characters to. So it was a very creative position for me. And then being in that environment with the incredible art of comic book covers, when I would take clients on tours of DC Comics, I mean, I was blown away by the wall of covers that I used to see, the incredible art, and then the writing is so amazing. So for me, it was great. It was just a totally incredibly creative environment, and we were given rein to be as creative as possible, as long as we always kept to the key brand guidelines of the characters. And my job was to also do no harm to the comic books, to the publishing business, and to be very respectful of the artists and the writers, and to make sure that art created for comic books wasn't used for licensing without that creator being paid appropriately, and which I always thought was amazing for a company to have that kind of respect for its creative talent.
Cool. Well, and you also were able to bring a lot of the artists who had worked on the comics to be able to do things.
We did.
Whether it was sculptures.
Yes, a lot of special products from. I don't know if you remember the Warner Brothers Studio stores, but when they were throughout the United States and some other cities around the world, we were producing so much art for those stores. Anytime you saw anything with a DC Comics character, that art was specifically produced for the Warner Brothers Studio stores for my department. And I think at one point we were sending them 50 different designs a week. And we needed more art, and we used some of the artists, we contacted some of the artists and commissioned them to create artwork specifically for the Warner Brothers stores. And then with DC Direct, which I oversaw for 10 years, being able to hire artists to do incredible sculptures of the characters was great for them. They got paid well, and the fans loved them.
Cool. Okay, so continuing our trend of hiring people from odd places, it's Cosmopolitan Magazine, the limp-wristed day on the Macy's Day Parade. This should not be taken as a suggestion of anything of Superman's sexuality. We found Lillian hiding with the Muppets. And when I interviewed her, she had an extremely eclectic background, and I kind of figured if you can deal with the Muppets, you can deal with our creative people. Many of them are closer to Oscar the Grouch than they are to Elmo, but they sort of represent all of that range of personalities. Tell us a little bit, the audience, a little bit about your various careers, Lillian.
Oh, how long do we have? No, I was a drama major in college, and I started out as an actress, so naturally I went to law school. And then, I mean, I spent a while acting, but I wound up in law school, and I started out at a large firm, and then I went to a smaller boutique firm specializing in copyright and trademark. And from there I went to work for Jim Henson, which was amazing. It was a very small company, and Jim was into everything, movies and books and television and whatever. And there was only a very tiny legal department, business affairs legal department that I was a part of. There were only 3 lawyers at the time, so we did everything and we learned everything. entertainment related. So when Jim was selling the company, coincidentally, DC was looking for their first ever in-house lawyer. And having represented only characters for the number of years, not people, that was right up my alley. And and so I interviewed for the job. And I just have to say, I interviewed with Paul, but I needed Jeanette's blessing. So we met, and I thought it was a test because, as Barbara said, Jeanette is a very stylish, wonderful
She looks like a
superhero.
superhero.
She
She's a
was,
force
yes,
of nature,
I thought she was a cross between Bette Midler and Wonder Woman. And she told me, actually, that the reason I got the job, she told me later, was because my initials were LL, and all of the important people in Superman's life had the initials LL. Lois Lane, Lex Luthor, Lana Lang. I think it was because I was wearing a fabulous pair of shoes that day. And I think that's what did it.
Did you change your name?
No.
LL?
That was my name. That is my
That's
name.
just-
So, but arriving at DC, what really struck me, I mean, I came from an extraordinarily creator-friendly company to another extraordinarily creator-friendly company. And this was at the time where the creators' rights movement was very much present, and creators were demanding more of their rights, and work for hire was an emotional trigger, not the legal concept that I had learned in law school. And what astonished me was that when I got there, Paul wanted to redo all of the talent agreements. And he spent, the amount of time we spent together with Chantal in your office every single day, going through all of these agreements and seeing how they could be improved for the talent, whether it was work for hire agreements or the first ever creator-owned agreements that we developed. The treatment of the creators was foremost in our minds. And for me, there was such a disconnect between what we were trying to do and what the creative community in general thought we were trying to do. But it was a great time.
Why was there such a disconnect?
Because people were angry, creators were angry, they hadn't received royalties from publishers, all of their work was owned and controlled exclusively by publishers at the time, and I think there was very little trust.
You know, if you view the relationship between creators and publishers in comics over the long history of it, the first 40 years, it's basically an abusive marriage. It's consensual. This was a Depression-era group of creative people who started out really happy to have jobs.
Well, you
And-
had all the power.
The publishers had all the power. The creators came largely from first generation immigrant families. They didn't have,
Thrilled to be published.
you were an exception coming into the field because you came in as an established professional from something else. You knew a number for a lawyer. Most of our creators did not.
Yeah.
A couple of years before Lillian got there, we did the book Ronin with Frank Miller, which was the first time we were going to let a creator have the copyright in their work as part of a deal. And we paid for Frank's lawyer. And we helped him find a lawyer because he didn't have one. And there was no lawyer anywhere who had represented a comic book creator on the East Coast. It didn't exist at that point. There were a couple of people who had done a little bit of work in the underground comics community, but that was a very, very different world and very different economics. And Jeanette and I, Joe Orlando and Dick Giordano, who were the two original creative leaders of DC below Jeanette on the team, all were very strong believers that, one, as a business principle, aligning the creative people's interests with the publisher's interests would result in better work. If we win, they win. But also that it was right. And the kind of energy we put in and the kind of beliefs that we've exhibited over our whole careers was not about how do we move the most number of poker chips from that side of the table to this side of the table. We want our fair share. We've got to run a business. We've got to make a profit. That's fine. But what's the fair division of it? And in the long run, if you try to treat people fairly, you won't always succeed. But hopefully you establish a relationship for it that will make more people willing to work for you in more different circumstances. And I think we did a good job on that. I think our reputations stand us in good stead. You witnessed that it's now, how many, it's got to be 20 years since you were full-time at DC almost, right, Lillian?
In 2010, I left.
2010, so 14
14
years.
years.
And you've built a second practice representing creators.
Right.
It's not, they didn't perceive you as the enemy. They perceived you as someone who understood the other side and were prepared to represent them to it, which would not have happened with any of the lawyers who were at some of our unnamed competitors over the years.
Unnamed again.
So,
Another thing, let me just say, another thing
Please.
that DC Comics paid an extraordinary amount of attention to that, for example, Marvel did not, was accounting. And that we had a royalty accountant whose job was to pay talent royalties. And to this day, DC Comics has, a good accounting department. And to this day, Marvel still doesn't do it properly.
It's true.
And there were many occasions over the years when people on the administrative side of the company would say, why do we have to do this just to give somebody $200? It can't possibly matter. But it did. It mattered to, maybe it didn't buy people more than a dinner. And maybe that was because, if Cheryl on DC Direct was doing an action figure of a character who had, this wasn't Batman, this was some minor character from God knows when, we weren't going to sell a whole hell of a lot of them. We were going to sell enough that we could make a profit, hopefully. Most of the time she managed to. But the open market fair value of something like that, if you were hiring someone to do creative work on it, would not have been a lot of money. But the fact that we paid something to say, thank you, here's an example of your work, here's a check, changed our relationship with the creative people. And
There was no doubt about getting that check. When I was doing Barbie for Marvel, I got my first royalty check, which was $35. And I took myself out to dinner. And I remember writing something to Marvel saying, hopefully next time I'll be able to bring a friend. And that was that.
One of my favorite times of the whole year was, when did we do this? Maybe in like November, when we would, the whole executive team would meet, and we would talk about the artists and the creators whose works had been used throughout the year in some extraordinary way, especially for my area, for any products. We would end up sending a check to a creator of a minor character that was used, or even when we did these brand style guides that we would give to the manufacturers who were licensed to use our characters, we bought out that work, and so the artist didn't get any additional money. But at the end, in this meeting, we would talk about, well, that artwork was really used a lot on a lot of different T-shirts by X number of manufacturers, and we would look at the numbers and go, you know what? Well, Paul, let's go. We're going to give that artist a surprise check, and it was just so thrilling to be able to do that.
A lot of this came out of Jeanette's personal philosophy, maybe as a rabbi's daughter, conjuring the Center for Jewish History. This happens to be her father's birthday. He's long gone, but that was one of the reasons she particularly wanted to be here. Rabbi Benjamin Kahn, thank you for your influence on the comic book industry. A lot of it came out of my practical respect for the original creators whose work I had grown up on. But it was the place. It was everybody felt good about being inclusive, being supportive of other people. I know that most of the conversation that you have at comic conventions about DC in the 80s or anything else, it's about the content. And the content was the most important thing that we did. But the content existed because of the attitudes. An Angel Love existed because Jeanette had the courage to say, I want to do something unlike what's out there. Because Karen Berger said, you know nothing about doing comics? Great, let me figure out how to show you something. Because when Barbara was having challenges working with the structure of comic book plotting, Dick Giordano and I got together with her for maybe an hour.
That was absolutely the best lesson of my life. I knew how to, I drew Angel, and she was pretty easy, and then I had some ideas, and every time I brought it into Karen, she would say, great, just go. And then I got to the plot line, and I was all over the place. I had no idea what she's talking about. And Paul and Dick spent about an hour with me. And I think it was even more than an hour, because I was sitting there so intimidated because the two of you are up there going, and then the main plot goes on the top and the subplots go on the bottom, and sometimes the main plot will be on the main plot on the 5th issue, and I walked out of there, my head spinning, and I really had no idea what you were talking about. And I remember going into Central Park saying, well, that's it for me. I'm not going to do any comics. And then, I'll never forget it, the heavens literally opened up, and the sun came through, and all of a sudden, I got it. And I went home, and I did 15 issues, 15 plot lines of that. And because it was, you know, when I was doing Ms. Liz, I knew eventually, you know, how far she could go and how far I had to hold back. But Jeanette kept pushing me forward. And I remember I went into a meeting with Karen, and Karen said, not this. And whenever an editor says, not this, but, you're getting an idea, but it's not exactly what it is. But she says, not this, but, you know, Angel's putting in her diaphragm and it goes sailing across the room. I was shocked. I said, you've got to be kidding. And that's when I was like, all the ideas about who Ms. Liz was and what I had to do just went out the window. And it was the greatest meeting. I walked out, I said, okay, I get it. And that's what, DC was like, for me, going to college, learning so much there. And it was because, you know, Jeanette wanted to do something for girls.
One of my favorite moments with Jeanette, one of the projects I'm really proud of our work on was the line called Milestone, which was a first attempt to empower a group of African-American creators in the field with a business of their own. And Lillian and I spent a tremendous amount of time finding a way to build a different contractual relationship that made that work. But we went with the 4 or 5 of them, Jeanette and I, and probably our head of marketing at the time, Bruce Bristow, up to Tarrytown House for a weekend for a conference to plot some strategies. We're figuring out what to do. And one of the things that was under debate, this was intended to be a series of books that was grounded, not to the extent of hip hop perhaps, but coming out of the real experience of a very wide diversity of people. And the conversation veers into street language. And Jeanette, bless her heart, who was very soft-spoken. We used to joke that Jeanette, Dick, and I, if we were the 3 monkeys, Dick had a hearing problem, he was the monkey who couldn't hear. I can't see for shit. And Jeanette's voice was so low that she was the one who didn't speak. But, you know, in her soft voice says, well, of course they have to be able to say fuck. And the guys who are, if you'll pardon the phrasing, this is a bunch of men of color, and all of their faces suddenly go very, very white. No, we want to be able to be on the newsstand, we want to be able to reach everybody, we'll figure out something. And they came up with a way of doing the curses with little scriggles and scraggles hiding what the actual thing the people were saying was. But
Today, is it just, can you write out the word?
it depends on the line. On a lot of the comics they do, not on all of them. I don't think they do it in the superhero stuff today, but I don't read much of what goes on today. Not that there's anything wrong with
We
it.
should
It's
do
just,
a book.
it's just not my time.
There should be a book called The History of Fuck, right? You know, when you're allowed to say it and when you're not.
That would be a
That's a good
pretty
one.
good seller, I suspect.
I think you're onto something.
Yeah.
Let,
Fuck, yes.
let's offer you guys a chance for a few questions, and if you don't have any, then I will make up some new ones. Hang on for the.
All of you have very detailed backgrounds. Paul, in your case, you came in originally as a freelancer and basically worked up the ladder. I have a two-parter in the sense of how did working originally as a creative help you be part of management, and what was the most challenging part of making that transition to management, and what you had to learn to be the creative, friendly boss that you ended up being?
You know, I adore the fact that I've spent my life immersed with creative people. You know, I started out as a comic book fan, I started out as a freelancer, and then an assistant editor at DC on the editorial side. I think the plus of it was that when I was on the business side, people couldn't quite view me as the enemy the same way that they traditionally viewed business people, because I had proved I could do what they did on a real level. The hard side in the transition, one of the most vivid memories I have, one of my dear friends in the business for my whole adult life, arguably before I count as an adult, is Marv Wolfman. I remember traveling with Marv and some other friends in England, going to the Worldcon, and I just sort of reached the point where I had some level of authority in the company. I guess at that point I was editorial coordinator, I don't remember what it was. And I'm traveling with my buddies going to these conventions, and we're on a train going from London to Brighton, and Marv starts hocking me. I don't remember what it was about. It was about some assignment he wanted or something like that. Not in any evil fashion or anything like that, but the boundary between being one of the gang and somebody who had some authority over them was stark at that moment. And that was a real challenge in life. Well, I couldn't have the same level of social life with my friends. You know, this is my gang. These are the guys I play poker with, and we're here having fun. And he, at that moment, couldn't stay with Paul, my friend, and it had to be Paul, the guy I'm negotiating with for that moment. Not evil, not anything horrible, and we've stayed friends for decades since. But it was one of the learning experiences, I think, in it. Next up. It's a rare shot, gang. Use it.
I had a question for Paul. What was your favorite superhero to write?
Usually depended on whose life I was screwing up. You know, I loved writing Legion of Superheroes because there were so many of them, and because there were so many, I could totally fuck with them. So somebody could die, somebody could, important emotional relationship could be breaking up. That's what created drama, right? One of the things that changed in comics in the 1980s, particularly for the superhero books, we didn't feel we had the same freedoms Barbara was talking about. I couldn't write about somebody's diaphragm. By the 30th century, they probably got a better technique anyway.
You probably couldn't write about it anyway.
Yeah.
You shouldn't.
I probably would not have been the right choice. But I could write about people having real relationships with challenges in relationships. And real things happen to people. People get sick, people die. And yeah, these were the soap opera equivalents of it, larger than life and less realistic than life. But you could begin to do that, which you couldn't with Superman. Problem with Superman is, you know, Lois and Jimmy are still going to be alive at the end of the damn story. And if it's not this, if this issue they seem to be dead, they're going to be back 2 issues from now. How do you make drama out of that? The Legion of Superheroes, I could kill somebody, and they weren't coming back as long as I was around. And that lasted a good while. So that was usually the most fun thing.
Hi. So it sounds like there was an impressive amount of women working at DC Comics at
No.
this time. But no, there was
Well,
not.
well, I think working, but not creatively. There weren't that
Right.
many women.
Oh, so women were typically on the business side of DC? Is that still the case today?
Business and editorial, many more than on the freelance side. You know, today, happily, maybe not, maybe as represented out there, I think women are 50% or more of the creative talent in the business.
Today?
I think we went from being 0.1% female in the talent pool around the time Barbara came in to, by the end of the 1980s, 0.1% maybe, something like that, I'm guessing.
But now the women, when I started, the comic book reader was 95% boys and 5% girls.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was superheroes. But today, the graphic novels, I would say most of the graphic novels are being done by women.
I don't know if it's most, but it's certainly it's a
Certainly
It's a
have.
solid share. So, but that brings up an interesting question related to it that let's spend a minute on. Lillian, Cheryl, the executive staff was very evenly balanced most of the time. Did that feel different than it had felt for you in other places you had worked?
Not for me, coming from Jim Henson. It was also, the general counsel was a woman. I was the assistant general counsel. Head of licensing was a woman. Head of publishing was a woman. So it was very comfortable. And same with the law firm I came out of. It was pretty balanced.
Well, that's
I was lucky.
I think for me, having Jeanette Kahn as the head of the company was, you know, was kind of a game changer. You know, I love you, but but I mean, she is just such an inspiring person. She's so creative. She's an outside the box thinker. She was just, you know, she set the tone really for the whole company. And so I think when I came in, maybe on the executive team, it was maybe more male, but she was there. So that made it, you know, very easy to be a part of that team. And I mean, I just think her contribution to the company is, there's
huge
just
presence, yeah.
there's just no words really. I mean, it was tremendous.
And it's stuff we paid attention to. You know, any number of times over the years, I ran a spreadsheet to see, it's very hard in a company that was as diverse in responsibilities as DC to see whether you were really dealing with equal pay for equal work, because the different kinds of work were so different. But I do think we tried to do that, certainly. But I'd run a spreadsheet of, okay, how many of the dollars in salary in the company are going to women versus men? And we were usually very close to 50-50. Obviously, Jeanette's leadership role and her compensation played part of it, but her compensation was not wacky out of line with the rest of us. She never was the kind of person who was fighting primarily for her own income. So we had a lot of good balancing factors, I think. I think we can squeeze one or two more, if we've got them.
Okay, so since this is DC in the 80s conversation, and there's a lot of talk about licensing and other media, this was around the time where Richard Donner's Superman was right before that, and then Frank Miller's Batman was going on, as well as Tim Burton's Batman movies and things like that. Can you kind of discuss
what it took to like deal with the balance of tone and how much other media would influence, like the Michael Keaton's version of Batman would influence what would go in on the books, and how much Frank Miller's version of Batman would kind of go into creating other media and things like that.
Well, Cheryl, why don't you tell the
Like,
story of...
in a balance and.
Yeah, no, I think that's I mean, there's two parts to that question. One part I think Cheryl can give an interesting answer to, which is talking about how you used the Batman animated series versus the Tim Burton movies to create diverse licensing programs so we reach different kids.
Right, so first of all, the time leading up to the first Tim Burton movie was like unbelievable. It was Bat mania, it was Bat fever. We could not, we literally couldn't get enough black cotton t-shirts to even, like, it was insane. We kept licensing manufacturers who had access. If somebody said, I can get black t-shirts, they became a licensee, because then they could put the Bat emblem that's on your hat on a t-shirt. It was absolutely Batmania, total insanity. And people really responded, obviously, to the darker Batman. It started with the acceptance of Frank Miller's Batman, and then and that led to Tim Burton's Batman. And then we were blessed with Batman the Animated Series, like the most incredible animated series on Batman. Such high quality, and Bruce Timm and Paul Dini and their work, and that enabled us to really build up a kids licensing program past the movie. During the first Batman movie, we had a great kids toy program, and of course all the pajamas and Halloween costumes and T-shirts and then going into video games. But the animated series really enabled us to extend the life of Batman in merchandising past the first movie, through the animated series until the next movie came out, and the next movie, and then subsequent animated series as well.
The other half of the question was how did all the films and everything affect it? Yeah. The biggest effect was the first Tim Burton movie, because that pretty much doubled the size of the comic shop market. There, notwithstanding what Cheryl said, we hadn't been able to get out a full licensing program early for the first Tim Burton movie because it had been in development for many years, and a lot of the licensees had sort of given up on us. Oh God, you're telling us there's a Batman movie again.
And it's dark.
Yeah.
And it's dark, and they were afraid of that.
Yeah. So people went to the comic shops because that was the only place you could get Batman stuff. And that really helped the industry tremendously. I think it's the only time Jim Galton of Marvel called me to say thank you over the years. That's not a criticism of Jim. I mean, he was a very good leader from Marvel. Very good for the comic book industry, and a very decent man. We disagreed about a few serious things over the years, the relative importance of creators versus characters, but he was a perfect gentleman. But I'll still appreciate that memory. Macy's doesn't thank Gimbels very often.
I have an additional question in regards to the milestone arrangement. It seemed to be forgive the pun, but it seemed to be a milestone of an arrangement. What was the nature of that arrangement? Obviously, it was a joint venture. I'm not asking for like the individual contractual details, but how did that? You said you put a lot of work into developing that arrangement. What was that arrangement in whatever way you feel comfortable sharing, and how did that impact creative arrangements for DC going forward from there?
I'll take a piece of it, and then I'll let Lillian answer it a different way. The essence of it was we were setting Milestone up as a packager, that they would create a body of creative material that we would bring to market. And as long as they packaged it within certain agreed upon parameters, X number of books, adhering to the Comics Code, not adhering to the Comics Code, whatever the rules were at the time, they would have creative freedom of it. And they would share in the revenues from it, they would share in the revenues from ultimately, for instance, there was a static TV series, and control. In terms of future, I don't think it ever became a working model for the comic book industry, because the only reason that succeeded even for amount of time is the guys put in a level of what's called sweat equity, hours and work, that made no sense for any human beings to do. This was such a work of passion on their part. It was, we're going to make up for the fact that we've been not locked out of the room, but we've not been allowed to be taken seriously in the room. We've not been allowed to be in control of things before. And if that means that we're not going to have social lives for the next 2 or 3 years, if we're not going to go home at a reasonable hour ever, that's fine. We'll do what it takes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, I can't think of anything like it that followed.
Not that I remember hearing.
No, I mean, it was a packaging deal, so there was this entity within DC Comics that was doing their own thing. So that's very unusual. I don't think it's been repeated. And they had control to some extent. I mean, we had approvals of stuff, and they retained the copyright, but I think we had a very long-term license of it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they got their rights back. I think it was a unique deal.
And I think, and this isn't a bad place to end, I think part of what we're proud of in all of this is that we were willing to be unique. The comic book industry from the 1930s through the 1970s and after it, at many of our competitors, didn't want to change. This is good enough. We pay them. They get paid. What the hell do they want besides getting paid? They ate.
Oh, is my royalty check in the mail now?
I hope so. I think he had some copies bound. Maybe he bought a reprint.
That mail.
But we went beyond it. We said, and again, core credit to that is to Jeanette. The balance between us. Jeanette led. I made things run. I figured out how to get things done. But she said, George, we're going up that hill. I don't care that nobody's been there before. I don't care that we don't know what's at the other side of it. That's the right place to go. Let's see. Let's see what happens. I'll take the responsibility of if we all get fired because of this, we all get fired. The hell with it. I do not claim to ever having been as brave as she was. I don't know that Batman: The Dark Knight Returns would have been published if I had been in charge at that moment. But she was. And then I could figure out how to actually do a deal with Frank that worked. And that's what we did. We figured out how to do things, we thought, in a way that was reasonably fair and that served the marketplace. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, and more. I'm going to assume that we have to thank you all for allowing us to have our livelihoods over the years, because whether Barbara got enough of a royalty check out of it or not, most of us managed to make a living. But she probably got some of her Barbie checks in the process.
Yeah, I got $35.
That was
Lady,
it.
That was the last
They're
one.
behind in their accounting.
All those checks are going to come in the mail. But unfortunately, I've changed addresses, so they're probably.
It's coming slowly.
It's coming.
Sam will collect them for you.
Call Charles.
Thank you,
Ryan.
gang.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, folks.
Thank you,
Thank
Paul.
you.